Allison, is it is it visible to you?
I believe it is. Yes, it is. See it. We're up and good.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for the opportunity, as per usual, and thank you for the Discord Cooey family for giving me this chance to kind of talk through one of our recent experiences in going through the joint surveillance assessment process. So I wanted to kind of level set the context of the topics that I wanted to share. But the context is essentially our organization was involved in a SMB OSC's joint surveillance experience as a managed service provider or managed security service provider and a VCSO. We're not like a traditional MSP where we do, the common IT MSP functions, but we're mostly focused on consulting, strategy, remediation, implementation, and then we also have a product, a GRC product, which is essentially our main focus that we have developed and leveraged as part of our services as well. So I kind of wanted to set that as the stage and essentially kind of describe like what our strategy was. Now, this particular SMB OSC was a small, about 20 user scope, but about 100 employees in total. And some of the strategies we had to kind of minimize the scope and trim it down to select individuals in the company, and then kind of make sure that that's all clearly defined and easily accessible. So that's kind of been our experience. Now I'll kind of jump into the next slide here. Give me 1 second. All right. So again, I kind of mentioned like who we are. So right now we our team is called IntelliGRC, and our parent organization is Tiber Creek Consulting. And so I'll kind of give you a little bit of background on our story. So IntelliGRC itself is a SaaS-based GRC tool. And then we also do have services. And we started that practice of both development of the tool and our services in 2016. We didn't really release our tool until 2022. We were essentially using it as part of like a tech-enabled service offering. And that was kind of built and born out of Tiber Creek Consulting, which is based out of Northern Virginia. Tiber Creek is an SMB DIB org themselves with about 200 plus employees, right now about 250. Most of their business is focused on systems engineering and software development and information assurance. They don't do things like staff augmentation and things like that. And then also kind of some other backgrounds that led towards this experience is our involvement with the NIST MEP, specifically the Virginia MEP, to create a program called the Virginia Defense CUI program in 2017. That was leveraging grant funding from the DoD OEA, like many of the other states. And during that time, since then, we've performed, I'm going to say about over 150 engagements to support primarily SMB DIB orgs in Virginia. And we provided services that was kind of a templatized standard service offering, and our platform as well. And most of the services were around like strategy on scope, gap assessment, and then the deliverables were typically a system security plan, a SAR, and a POAM, and an incident response plan template that's kind of pre-seeded. And then essentially the intent behind even doing the services was primarily, even to date, focused on R&D for our and roadmap strategy for our product, since that's kind of our main focus. And one of the things I like to kind of talk through is like our mission, which is to commoditize cyber compliance, is kind of like the high level mission statement. And some of the emphasis on that is the automation and efficiency through a product or a tool like IntelliGRC. One of the other things we wanted to do is, seeing the industry's got the high demand, low supply, heavy, expensive consulting services because of the high demand, low supply. And so we wanted to be kind of part of the change to foster entry level into the field. And so the Virginia MEP actually connected us to another grant at the state level called the Go Virginia Cyber Grant. And the recipients of that grant was a small community college called Blue Ridge Community College in the Shenandoah Valley region of Virginia. And the whole mission was to retrain rural Virginians in technical positions like cyber, so they can get access to jobs that are, predominantly accessible in like busy metropolitan areas like Northern Virginia. And so we helped develop the curriculum. And essentially the grant would cover students to go through a boot camp. They get credits towards an associate's degree, and then at the end they get a paid um, examination to the Security Plus exam. And if they pass that exam, they would get paid internship opportunities with us, and then possible conversion to full-time employment. So we actually started that in 2019, and it's in picture up here in the top right is essentially our first graduates from the first cohort. It was pretty great in that those folks kind of grew within our team and helped us grow our business. And then, we just kept rinsing and repeating, and turned out to be great because we were fostering, in my opinion, rock stars. um, and then also the idea behind that is so that we can leverage our folks to provide cost-effective services and solutions. The idea being that, if it takes long to do something to help a client navigate these different aspects of cyber compliance, it's more motivation to make it more efficient through the tool. And so that kind of like prioritizes, well, let's prioritize the tool's efficiency so that we can drive costs down. And then also our involvement in the DoD DibNet SMB working group, as well as the DIB SEC and the ISAC working groups to represent DIB SMB DIB orgs. A lot of the work we did there recently, some of the folks on the CUI Discord were involved in that, was mostly focused on providing feedback and input to DoD CIO and Carnegie Mellon on the CMMC assessment and scoping guides. Now, I mentioned the MEP because this particular client that we went through the joint surveillance assessment process with, we actually met them 2 years ago through the Virginia MEP program. They came in and said, "Hey, we want help," and we heard about this grant. And so that's where we first met them, did their first assessment. And this was essentially prior to CMMC 1.0 being finalized. It was in draft status. So we were focusing on pretty much 800, 171 at the time. And, kind of did some gap assessment deliverables and said, here's where you are, here's some high level strategies, and then, essentially disconnected. Since then, that SMB org went and worked with some other MSPs and service providers to work on their gaps and whatnot. And then they actually came back and re-engaged twice with us on any help with policies, procedures, and things like that. And it was actually an interesting journey because they re-engaged with us, I want to say towards the end of 2022, right after they had spoken to a C3PAO and said, "Hey, I'm interested in the joint surveillance process." And then they came back and said, "Hey, you guys helped us in the past. We want you guys to essentially take us to the finish line." So now that takes me to our next slide to talk about the joint surveillance assessment process experience at a high level. So this client in particular actually met the C3PAO at the 2022 Washington, D.C. CS2 event. And I hope it's okay for me to say, and she's probably listening, but the C3PAO that I'm referring to is Kiri Solutions. And it was, and I was actually in the crowd when I saw essentially Amir on stage doing a presentation talk. She walked off the stage, and the first person that walks up to her was the CEO of that SMB organization that we had helped. And I was like, "Hey, I know that guy." I just saw him talking to Amira, and I was like, "I wonder if he's asking her about her availability for an assessment." And then shortly after, he actually pinged us, and then sure enough, that was the case. And so from our experience at a high level with working with Carrie and this SMB client, it seemed that the joint surveillance was predominantly led in this experience by Kiri, the C3PAO. So things like project management, scheduling, and organizing just everything from the beginning to end. We were aware that DibCAC was involved with the C3PAO, and that the C3PAO would lead the charge, but essentially we didn't realize that the C3PAO took a backseat, and I don't really know what they did. I mean, they were supposed to observe, but they literally took a backseat and did not do much, not much talking. And I mention that because I've heard other stories where the DibCAC takes the lead and the C3PAO is kind of following suit. But in this particular case, the C3PAO is taking lead, and we were extremely fortunate that it was Amira's team because they came well organized and prepared. And if they were not, DibCAC was not prepared. There was probably going to be a lot of chaos. So that was extremely helpful. And so, like I said, the C3PO in that situation, Kiri, led pretty much the entire assessment, carried 99.9% of the weight. There were 4 assessment team members involved, and the roles were a QA lead, a lead assessor, and then 2 assessment team members. And then the experience that we had was that the assessment team essentially split up the domains and families amongst the team members, and pretty much kind of organized it that way. And then there was a 5-day schedule where we kicked it off a few weeks prior, and then the schedule started on a Monday and went on till Thursday up until the afternoon. And then Friday we were pretty much not doing anything, and we were just waiting for the final report. Now, I'm going to just take a quick step back before I get back into the JSV experience, but I felt this was important to mention, which is, how to find the right C3PAO. Now, most folks would just say, go to this CyberAB's marketplace, look for the C3PAO there, and just engage with them for multiple quotes. I think that's kind of inherently understood. So we actually felt that we wanted to do a little bit more vetting for our customers. And a lot of the customers we've dealt with who are leveraging a subscription to our tool and our services for vCISO and other services, we like to vet things, whether it be a solution or another service provider. And that way we can come up with a list of those that we vetted and can make good recommendations. Our customers have established that trust with us, and they want us to be involved at that level. So I went ahead for a couple clients, including this one, engaged with 14 C3PAOs. Initially, it was for another client, and I got quotes, got on phone calls, set up meetings, discussions, and I created a set of evaluation criterias and gave them a rank against them. And so some of the most important ones for the SMB folks have been price, obviously. But the other one that I would say was important that we recommended was organization and making sure they're efficient. And there's a lot of telltale signs that we experience to determine that. For example, their proposal and their statement of work. How is it structured? How is it written? What's the terminology being used? Does it seem digestible? Does it seem easy to understand? We've had hit or miss there. But those that had pretty strong statement of works in their proposals, and clearly painted the picture to set expectations, that gave them a better result, and it made us feel better about wanting to work with them. The other thing that we felt was pretty important was subject matter expertise. And I'm not just talking about CMMC. What you want to do is focus on what are the things that you feel are most relevant to your business and your organization. And I mean things like your strategy on policies, your procedures, your culture even, as well as your technology landscape. If you have things like modern SaaS infrastructure type capabilities, think of like Docker and Kubernetes, for example, or platform as a service in Azure or AWS. I can't tell you how many times historically working in the NIST RMF space, in the FedRAMP space, that I've had to spend more time explaining to an assessor that you cannot install antivirus on a Docker container. um, but then trying to explain how the spirit of the intent is met. And you want to focus on like what is your capabilities and making sure that that C3PAO has a good judgment of your strategy and your technical aptitude as well. And then the other thing that I felt was kind of a hit or miss across the C3PAOs that we spoke to was the fairness aspect. I couldn't find a good word for that, but the idea being if I wanted to see their attitude or their approach to, asking more questions or drilling deeper into a control. And I say that because, some folks out there publicly are pretty black and white. Or sometimes you have to talk to them to get that understanding where they're like, you either do this or you die. And then others are more understanding in that there's 1,000 ways to skin this cat. And as long as we can effectively demonstrate the spirit of the intent, we would have a good understanding between the assessors and the OSC team. Now, the other thing I was going to mention is moving on to some preparation tips. So I kind of try to summarize some general high-level tips to start. And these are pretty common tips that you would experience with any type of audit or assessment or third-party validation. And so one of the things that we kind of heavily focused on was, identifying the participants, the key roles that need to be involved in the assessment. For us, in this particular case, this OSC client of ours pretty much outsourced everything to us. We were responsible for getting everything implemented from 0 to 110, from the technical side, the policy, the procedure side, even some of the management and maintenance side, training them on some of the management and maintenance of the controls, the strategy, and then even during the assessment, the entire assessment was communicated. The communication was just between my team, myself, and the assessors. Our client pretty much, only stepped in where necessary or when I said, hey, could you elaborate on this? But for the most part, they were lucky to pretty much take a back seat. And I say lucky because, if you're not going to spend the energy to train that OSC on what to say and when to speak, and if they don't have the knowledge to do that for all the different aspects of CMMC, then it's probably better you represent them as best you can. So I focused on making sure that the entire team that was involved knew when to speak and what things to say. And again, one of the common things that you always tell folks before an assessment is don't over-explain, don't talk too much, let the assessors drive what they're looking for, let them ask the questions, and when you respond to those, be as brief and concise as possible. Over-explaining is, going to lead to potentially more challenges, whether it be unintended findings, concerns, issues, and they may go off in a tangent and drill into things that are now irrelevant from the original question, and it could waste everyone's time, right? So try to be as brief and concise and only respond to what you're being asked for. The other thing I can't recommend heavily is doing rehearsing, right? Rehearsing your team with your team on, what things to show and say, and having that kind of documented and laid out in some ways is extremely helpful. And the other thing that I would say is, documentation, right? Things like your SSP or any documentation that's provided for the assessment for that matter, it should do a really good job at telling a story, painting a picture, explaining things. For example, every time I'm working with a client and I have analysts on my teams that are drafting up system boundary diagrams or data flow diagrams in collaboration with the clients, they always come back to myself and others for like quality reviews and say, hey, what do you think? Do you think this paints the picture? And then I'll say, well, this is unclear to me, or, or I would actually do it this way. And the whole point of that is if the assessor can't just look at that boundary diagram and that data flow diagram and just kind of almost immediately understand the scope and remove any assumptions or any uncertainty and say, oh, got it. I know exactly what you look like. That makes sense. At least so that the rest of the storytelling that they get from the SSP aligns with that visual. Um, and so I always say, do it at a high level with your diagrams, but do it enough that it paints the picture. And you obviously don't want it to be too busy because you could lose lose your audience, right? They might not understand, or they might drill too deep into something, and it would be harder to digest. And then the other benefit in just explaining things clearly and concisely in that storytelling or in your documentation, your SSP, is so that you have less of a need to verbally explain things or to demonstrate things. The more you could provide up front, the faster and smoother that assessment's going to go. Um, and so the other thing that I say is, yes, the assessor is not our customers. They're not the OSC's customers. They're not MSP customers. Sometimes we tend to think of their enemies, right? Or we got to put up a fight with them and treat them as the other team. That's not the case. In this case, you want to make sure whatever you're giving them is of quality, and that the materials provides as much clarification, as I mentioned, as possible, to make sure it's smooth and successful. And even though it's not a deliverable to you, potentially to a paying customer, but if it's paid for, but at the end of the day, you just want to make sure it's going to be of quality and is clean. And so some of the examples I talk about is like organizing evidence. So what we did is we had to follow a naming convention for evidence, for the artifacts, a folder structure where we had like a folder for like multiple artifacts, where we would put things like policies, procedures, the SSP, the IRP, baseline configurations, FIPS certifications, evidence of FedRAMP, moderate equivalency, et cetera, et cetera. We put that in this folder called multiple, and we actually put a number 1 in the beginning of the folder name so that it would just be automatically put at the top. And then we created folders for each of the domains and families, and then organized anything that's more explicit to those practices and AOs down into those different folders. But if they were mappable to multiple things in a many relationship, they would go into the multiple location at the root. The other thing we did is we put README files in the root of certain folder structures that we felt were getting too busy or complicated. And again, just we wanted to have that README file clear. It was just a text file that acted kind of like a table of contents, and it said, this folder is meant for this. These files are kind of this, right? And so that kind of tells them where to look. Makes it easier for them to not have to dig in and figure out what they're looking at. If you could just answer that up front, it'll save a lot of time and energy. The other thing that is key is mapping evidence to each AO in a many-to-many relationship. At first, we thought, okay, well, there's 320 AOs. We might have to create a piece of artifact for each one, and then realize that that's not going to make sense. And in this engagement, the assessment plan from the C3PAO included some naming convention examples, and it did a really good job of saying, if it addresses multiple AOs in a single practice, use this naming convention where you're referencing the AO letter. But if it addresses multiple practices or AOs across different practices, then you can essentially put it in that multiple folder, but then you would want to provide some kind of mapping, whether it be a matrix or in your SSP that says, this artifact file name is supporting this AO or this practice. In this case, Carrie, the C3PAO, did a great job at providing an evidence plan as part of their engagement, where they were able to say, these are the kind of things we're looking for based on our consensus on scope. And that helped tremendously. So we were able to use that as kind of our mapping matrix, but then we also had already a flavor of that we ended up replicating into our SSP for each of the AOs. Some other tips that I wanted to share is some of the technical implementation approaches. And so, to have less documentation needed in an assessment, if you can, and if you do your best when it's affordable, efficient, or feasible to do so, use technical solutions to either enforce something or automate something. Because if you can't enforce or automate, depending on your C3PAO, in my opinion, the right thing to do is to explain how you're mitigating the risk or how you're treating the risk or if you're even identifying it as a risk. Like if it's something you can't enforce or automate, then you have to kind of describe it through your administrative approach. Um, and so if you can do it, great. That's less documentation needed to some extent. And then where there's technical solutions for different use cases and reasons that you can't automate or enforce it, just make sure there's an administrative capability implemented, like your policies, procedures, clearly defined roles, responsibility, and then having those kind of things referenced in like a risk assessment or your SSP again. So, like for example, if you can't enforce some kind of technical control, then how are you addressing the risk through policies or procedures, and how is that risk identified and documented in a risk assessment? Things like that. And then that way you can kind of better describe the mitigating solution or what is the alternative approach that's not technically enforceable but is done through some administrative control capability. And then making sure that if you're going to do that in like a risk assessment and document such a thing, that those treatment decisions are documented and that either leadership or the responsible parties have essentially accepted those things. And then so the approach we took for this particular joint surveillance client, this OSC, we basically, like I said, their business was primarily a mixture of software services, engineering services, but a lot of it was kind of staff augmentation, right? So they were majority of their employees were able to use GFEs at government locations, right? They're not even leveraging the OSC's infrastructure for handling CUI. The only thing they're leveraging from the OSC was things like timesheet, right, and managing their employee records and things like that. So this helped us scope down the CUI boundary essentially, and so we basically took it down to a 20 user boundary that just simply was all cloud, all virtual, and it was basically laptops with Windows, and then Microsoft 365 GCC High with like Azure AD, Sentinel, Defender, Intune, etc. And that kind of helped us keep things smaller and cleaner. The other thing that we were able to do because of that is remove the dependency on the physical security aspect. So that way the assessment could be conducted virtually. And this organization had already gotten rid of all on-premise infrastructure in the past. And so, that way we were able to, they did have one physical office, but it was treated the same way that somebody would be sitting at a Starbucks, right? So there was no trust in that office per se. Although we still had people there, right, employees, and so there was still some concern with their safety and their laptops and whatnot. But we addressed those in the SSP. So I can't emphasize that as much. If you can minimize the scope, do it as much as possible. All right. The next thing I wanted to kind of talk through for preparation tips is on the administrative solution side. So, like from a policy perspective, for the SMB space, I constantly preach less is better for management and maintenance of these documents, right? You don't want to have documentation overload. You don't want it to be too busy and complex and to a point where it's not usable and it's not actually doing its job. I try to find a good balance between simplicity and ease of digestion and readability with risks and actual security, right? Not just checking the box for compliance, but also making sure, we've got a strategy to address any risks around that. So we also try to emphasize focusing on mandates. So, we already had our own, through our tool, set of policy templates for CMMC specifically. And we try to basically focus on making them high level statements, things that are just simply mandates like thou shall and thou shall not do these things. And then not trying to get into specific solutions or how it's being implemented. So that way, the dependency on the maintenance of that document is less of a concern. You don't have to update it as frequently. You could update your SSP and your procedures, using those things as living documents. Yes, you want to review your policies every once in a while, but if you keep it simple, you shouldn't have to change it too much. The other thing we put an emphasis on is just making sure those policies define roles and responsibilities. The way we did that was using a RACI or a RACI chart, where at the bottom of the policy, we took every subsection of the policy. If it was an access control policy, a subsection could be access enforcement or remote access. And those subsections would map to different roles. And for each of those roles, we said, who's responsible, who's accountable, who do we want to consult on an ongoing basis, and who do we want to inform about these things. And we also try to minimize the amount of documents needed for policies. So we try to merge topics where we can. And so, for example, like the access control and the IA domain, the identification authentication domain, we just merge those two things into one document called the access control policy. And taking into consideration any risks based on a use case for that client, we basically were able to do a pretty decent job in understanding at how much details do we need to get into, and how much of it can we just put somewhere else. And then the other thing we tried to do is minimizing the need to distribute like all these policy documents to everyone in the company, right? Nobody wants to read like 20 plus documents and dry language of this is what you can and can't do. And it doesn't make sense for somebody in HR to know when vulnerability scans need to be conducted, right? Or how it should, or who's responsible for it. Like they probably don't care. Instead, we use that RACI chart to essentially inform that if there are general end users in the organization that need to be informed because it's a risk if they're not. So they need to be made aware, because if we don't, it's a risk. Or if they're responsible for something or have some partial responsibilities to make sure something's being done in accordance with the policy. We basically extracted that to produce a starting point for the acceptable use policy. And then we elaborated on it based on risks that are applicable to that OSC's use case scenarios and their business model and their business processes. And so that basically helped us make it so that policies are digestible, where, unless that group is responsible for something like an access control policy, which would be, let's say, the IT department, for example, or maybe even HR, right? Those are the folks that we would distribute those policies for. Rather than all of the policies, it would just be the ones they have some kind of responsibility or accountability for. And then everybody else just gets the AUP, right? Everyone gets the AUP, but not everyone gets the policy docs. And so the idea is that AUP would inform them of what you can and can't do. And we even baked in an acknowledgement process and form so they can, read it and just acknowledge it. I think that's pretty important, as well as making sure that there is acknowledgement. We actually did it through like a checklist in SharePoint Online, where they can read the document and hit this button using Microsoft Forms embedded capability in SharePoint that says, I accept, I acknowledge, automatically records their username, email, and the date and time stamp, and so on and so forth. So it keeps a paper trail as well. The other thing that I also can't emphasize enough is making sure that your policy statements are mappable to assessment objectives. Your assessor is looking to see what you're doing at each AO. They're not looking at the practice level. So making sure that you can map things to the AO level, whether it be how you're doing something or a document or an artifact, is great, is going to be necessary, but it'll help a lot. And so we actually created a policy matrix that shows, the policy documents in the column headers, the CMMC practices and AOs on the left-hand side in the first row, and then a mapping matrix that says, this doc section statement number 6.2.3 is mapped to this AO. And we did that in a many-to-many matrix to make sure we have full coverage. And having that as an artifact to share with your assessor just gives them the shortcut blueprint to where to look. And they're going to love you for that, right? Again, the emphasis being the less you have on their plate to dig into, the smoother, the faster, and the more in control you are of your outcome. If you don't do those things, you're at their mercy of when they feel like drilling in to certain things and staying high level in other things. But if you drive the show by giving them that mapping matrix, giving them basically a roadmap of where to go, where to look, what to focus their attention on, you're indirectly guiding the assessment and the experience that they have. So I can't emphasize that enough, and it definitely is something that I know assessors appreciate. Um, the procedure side for preparation is our strategy that we took was essentially going through the policies and those mapping matrices to the AOs and controls, and then taking in consideration of some of the risks that we were identifying and documenting, and basically coming up with a list of what procedures we want to produce as an artifact and would need as evidence, and doing so in a way that could provide a paper trail to demonstrate conformance with those procedures. And so we kind of took two factors into consideration for that, which is, if something needs to be done in a consistent and repeatable manner to avoid risks, the two factors are if it's based on an ad hoc event, like a new hire, firing or termination of someone, acquiring a new system or technology, incident response, change management, you probably want to have that as a well-defined procedure because it's something that you want to be done consistently and repeatedly, to avoid any risks. And the nice thing is if you do so in a certain format, you can even create, that auditable paper trail that I mentioned. The second factor is, if there's something that you think needs to be done consistently, based on time, right? So this is kind of a emphasis to the continuous monitoring strategy, right? The Kanban strategy. And so that is like, identifying how often you want activities to occur and at what frequency. Is it once a week, once a month, once a year? So some examples are like, how often do you want to patch your systems and make sure they're getting patched? So we're going to review those once a month, doing vuln scans once a month in accordance with the patch cycle, reviewing audit logs. And we actually even took it down a step further is we had some audit logs that we were doing on a weekly basis that were automated where we had essentially configured Azure Sentinel to send an automated email report that summarized like what you needed to pay attention to, and then paired it with like a user guide, like a one pager that says focus on these elements. So things like making sure you're looking at who's touching the SharePoint project locations where CUI exists and what they're doing, creating folders, files, downloading files on their laptops, uploading, checking in and out documents, things like that. Reviewing at any configuration changes, things that you think might happen more frequently. We created like a automated weekly email report using Sentinel. And then we also created some ad hoc reports and visuals, with like a user guide instruction, like a step-by-step guide, for like monthly audit reviews. And then you've got other things like, annually doing an assessment or however often you want to do those things. One tip that I will say, and it ended up being an initial finding for us, was for the continuous monitoring, you want to make sure you have coverage for all of the practices and AOs as best as possible. We made the mistake of, and I wouldn't say it's necessarily a mistake, it's just our interpretation. I don't think it was necessarily wrong. It was just not giving that that information that the assessors would need to confidently agree with it. And it was basically, creating policies mapped to AOs and then extrapolating that to create procedures and then extrapolating that to create a scheduled cadence of events that need to happen, like every time a new hire is hired, and then this time-based event, which is once a week or once a month or once a year, you're performing certain activities. And so we created that document that pretty much lays out what happens and when. And then we even put shared calendar notification reminders of those activities, and attach the user guide to those so that the responsible person gets a notification. Oh, it's that time for me to go and look at this report. And let me go log in and follow this step-by-step instructions. And so we assumed that we kept it very basic and simple and ended up with the activities that we created auditable, documented procedures for. I think it was less than 50 or around 40 different types of things that we wanted to capture a paper trail for. And then with the assumption being like something like a security control that says perform a security assessment at whatever defined frequency. And we assume that would be our catch-all for all of the controls and AOs, right? Because it's in our, once a year checklist, we perform an internal assessment, right? But it wasn't clear that strategy, right? Our approach was to simplify our customer's life, but that strategy wasn't clearly communicated to the assessor. So they weren't seeing the coverage. And so they said, I don't see coverage for everything. And so we were like, well, we could probably give you an artifact, which was what we used to design this approach, which was the requirements document that shows coverage for each and every control. And so we provided that, and we were able to kind of get past that hiccup. The other thing I like to say is make your procedures as simple and easy to follow, right? If you can fit it in one page, great. And so we like doing things like in a SOP checklist or a form, so that it does two things. It informs the steps to be taken in a consistent and repeatable manner. And two, when you fill it out, it makes sure it gets done and then creates that paper trail that you can go back and audit, right? So this way you could even manage other risk factors like, a machine did not get the endpoint protection solution installed, and you can go back and say, let me look at that checklist. It was filled out by this person. Why didn't that get done? It looks like you checked that part off, or whatever it was. If you can't automate it, put it in the checklist. If you can automate it through like things like imaging solutions, in our case, we ended up using Intune, and we're able to, automate as much of that as possible. And then again, for those frequency things, like I had mentioned, we use notifications through a shared calendar, which kind of served as that reminder. Now, on the evidence preparation side, you do want to have coverage for each of the AOs. And again, you could do that in a many-to-many relationship, so that way there's less things you need to produce or provide. And if you have a good C3PO, they should be able to give you a guide and template. In our case, we were able to give in a template to fill in ourselves so that it's the matrix they would rely on. And they just said, tell us what we need to look for as evidence for each of these AOs. And that was extremely helpful, because then we were able to just quickly tell them, right, and fill that in. And that way they don't have to ask that every time. And it made it a lot smoother and faster. And the other thing is that as part of the assessment kickoff and the planning, we had to get on the consensus of multiple things, right? Things like the scope, things like, are you using an external system? And is that external system FedRAMP moderate or equivalent? FIPS validated certificate, can that be confirmed for the things that require it? Do you have that? And are you using an external service provider? And are they in scope or not in scope? And then there's different aspects of that. So in our situation, we participated in the assessment, but we were able to remove our organization's systems as not being in scope by essentially, and this is what we do with all our clients, by essentially using their identity provider, Azure AD, and one of their laptops that's managed by Intune and Defender and so on and so forth. And so we were in their system as no different as an employee, but basically we're a contractor or a vendor. And then as part of that scoping and planning exercise, you also have to communicate your categorization of asset inventory. So for each of the devices, the people, external systems, software, etc., we were able to mark those things as these are CUI, these are security protection assets, these are contractor risk managed assets, and so on and so forth. And once we were able to get that consensus, that also informed us of like the detailed of evidence needed. So like if it was a control relevant to CUI protections, right? You want to get that FIPS validated cryptography verification. You want to get that FedRAMP moderate equivalency if it's in the cloud, et cetera, and have that prepared. And so some of the evidence types that we had were essentially the ability to say this is an artifact, and artifacts were typically for us a screenshot or filled out SOP checklist that was completed in the past, et cetera, et cetera. And then there was other evidence types where we said, you're going to reserve these. And this is essentially where the C3PAO drove when they wanted to see screen shares or demonstrations. And so that helped us say, okay, well, I don't need to provide a screenshot of it. I'm just going to show them when they're here. And then document being, things like policies, procedures, your IRP, your SSP, et cetera. And then physical reviews if you have, obviously, your physical facilities in scope. In this case, they were not in scope. And then also, again, if you are focused on ensuring you have something for each AO, again, do not make it unique per AO. Like, nobody wants to dig through 320 plus artifacts. If you could do that many to many mapping and relationship, that's going to save everyone time and energy, knocking multiple birds with one stone. And every time we submitted evidence, we always tried our best to provide narratives for what are you looking at. This is a screenshot of the shared calendar that shows, you're notified once a month of doing something. And here's the SharePoint repository where we store a completed SOP checklist for these different activities, and so on and so forth. And even those have a review process to make sure they're being done, and so on and so forth. So if you can explain those as part of the evidence, that's less questions that are going to be asked. That's less things you need to talk about during the week of the assessment. So again, artifacts, right? We always try to pair those with narratives. And if there were screenshots, rather than sending a PNG file, I would, if they're all in the same context or topic, I would just put them in a single Word doc with the narrative, right? So it could be one document that has multiple screenshots and narratives baked into it. Again, minimizing the amount of things you need to produce and send. And then the documents, we already kind of talked about what those look like. And then the demonstrations, one thing that I was extremely grateful that we did was for each of those AOs where the assessor was like, hey, I'm going to ask you to demonstrate this. We wrote like high-level bullet point notes in there that said, the engineer is going to log into Intune and look at this setting, or go to Defender and pull up the vuln management screen, right? And so we even it's like not just rehearsable, but also like it's our talking points, right? So it's telling us where to go, and so those are all things that were written down so that our side had a consensus on what to show, and it just made it clear and a lot easier and smoother. And then the physical review, we already kind of talked about that. Could you show anything for the physical security controls, like locked cabinets, doors, etc. So at a high level, I just wanted to say, I actually didn't have enough time to put all of the lessons learned that I wanted to put in here. I'm hoping at a next talk about this topic, I'll have more time. But again, I'll just kind of summarize some of our experiences. Take your time to prepare. This client's journey started with us, even themselves, over 2 years ago. They thought they were good. In fact, this is a common situation we always come across where when they first approached us, they were like, we think we're ready. We just want you to double check that. Right. And here we're like 5 to 7 months out from the time that they might have their assessment scheduled. And we actually, so they had hired the C3PO Carrie, I think in October of 2022, around that time frame. And the request was submitted probably November timeframe, maybe September. And DIBCAC didn't respond until, I want to say, end of February, early March, and said, hey, we could put you in the schedule on, at the end of May. And so from that moment on, there was the schedule that they proposed was May 22nd of 2023. And so that was like several months in between. But we didn't get confirmation until like about 2 to 3 months beforehand. And even that's just a waiting game, right? You're at their mercy and make sure they're available. But yeah, so I would say take your time. The client came to us thinking they were ready and close. And then when we dug into the details at the AO level and just drilling them on making sure they had something for everything, we're like, dude, you've got a lot left to do, man. Like you've got some things, but on the technical side, you don't have this, or maybe you want to implement this or enforce this on the technical side so that it's less documentation needed. And so we hit the ball on literally building out the entire environment and the GCC high tenant, their laptops, and so on and so forth. There's about 3 of us on our team. We built it out within 3 months. It was like, built it out and then got straight to the assessment, and then 2 weeks later got a 110 score, right? So there was like a lot of moving pieces. It was stressful at times, but again, I can't tell people, like, before you think you're ready, talk to someone that you think is going to be able to verify that. Whether they're an RPO or a C3PO. But even then, there's tons of snake oil out there. We already know that in our Discord community. Um, and so you won't really know until you like trial them. So I always tell people, like, ask questions, trial them. Even in the questions, interview the consultant you're using, interview the C3PO, give them scenario based questions like you would when you're hiring somebody, right? See how they respond to get a feel for what to expect. And then again, try to provide coverage where possible. Even when the assessor said, I want a demonstration for this, we still provided, in some cases, an artifact and that narrative that said, during the demo, click here and show this. So we did both in some cases. We probably didn't need to, but we did, just so that there would be less confusion, less question to ask. Everyone's on the same page, kind of thing. And then again, ensuring clarity and consistency. Explaining things clear and concisely, not over explaining, but also finding that good balance in between. Um, getting the right messaging across, but also not doing writing a novel to explain that concept or whatever it is you're trying to explain. On the C3PO side, again, I can't say it enough. The Kiri solutions assessment team has been awesome. They literally made this a breeze. If they weren't the C3POs, I have no idea what would have happened, because of the fact that DibCAC was not prepared whatsoever. It just seemed like they didn't even know what was going on. Gary did a phenomenal job at organizing everything, scheduling everything, setting expectations, managing those expectations, and then even checking in with DibCAC during the entire assessment. Like, hey, you guys good? You guys have questions? Are we good to move on to the next control? And oftentimes, Amira can tell you, DibCAC wouldn't even respond. We're like, oh, they're probably out grabbing a beer or something, and they're on mute. But yeah, so can't say it enough. They've been phenomenal. They've been a huge, huge asset to our experience, and I can't recommend a company like that enough. And then also, a couple other things that I was going to just give tips on is make sure, sometimes people say, well, when do I know if I'm ready? If you can't clearly say what does CUI look like for your company and have an intended data flow diagram that shows like the authorized and intended ways that should traverse your boundary and the business processes associated and the people that are involved with touching that information, that is very important to be confident on. If you're not confident in that, you're not ready. If you can't describe in your control implementation statements at even the AO level, with confidence, how you're meeting that spirit of the intent with evidence or an artifact or the ability to demonstrate, you are not ready. Even our control implementation statements, we tried our best to follow what we had experienced in some of the federal civilian government work that we've done in the past for NIST RMF and ATOs. An example I give, is DHS uses this concept called the OIG format. And it says if it's an administrative control, or actually for any control for that matter, you have to answer who, what, when, where, and how as applicable. And then if it's technical, in addition to that, if you have differing technology platforms like Linux, Mac, Windows, different cloud systems, and you're not inheriting a capability from a security protection asset like Azure AD for single sign-on, then you have to describe how you're implementing those controls at the different platforms at those different levels. even in like the ATOs that we've done, we've had to do that for the application layer, the database layer, and the operating system layer, if it was, using those technologies. So if you can't, you want to try your best to inherit as much as possible from your security protection assets. Make sure it provides those security functions. So things like account and identity management, password complexities. If you could use Azure AD, implement federation, single sign-on with other systems, other endpoints, other cloud systems, etc. Do that as much as possible. Same with your MFA. If you're managing it separately, it's going to be really tough. And so you have to demonstrate how those are managed. You have to explain it at that level. So that's one of the biggest tips that I can give there. Other than that, I mean, I think again, like a lot of folks out there, like even some of the consultants, they're going and performing these gap assessments and saying, I think you're ready, you're not ready. They're very high level, very nebulous. The devil's in the details. Like when you go through a DIBCAC or a joint surveillance assessment, the experience has been different, but I'd even say there have been some consistencies, and that consistency is the details, right? Going down the rabbit hole, showing an artifact for each AO, implementation statements for different platforms and things like that. It gets very, 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 very complicated. And always try to find those little strategies where you can simplify and merge things together, and do it as efficiently as possible. But I can't tell you how many times we always have companies coming saying we're ready and they're not, because they're not even describing enough of how they're doing it, or how they're meeting the spirit of the intent. And we're just like, yeah, you've got a lot more to go, right? There's a lot more work to be done. But with that, I mean, that's the end of the presentation, and thanks again for everyone's time.
It was awesome. Thanks, Ozzie.
Thank you.